It was a rainy evening, and I was sitting in my living room with my husband, trying to stay warm and dry as the rain pounded against the windows. Our daughter, who had recently started dating a new guy, was spending the night at his house, so we didn't have to worry about her being alone in this weather. Or so we thought. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My husband went to answer it, and I could hear him talking to someone, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I got up to see who it was, and my heart stopped when I saw who was standing on our doorstep. It was our daughter's ex-boyfriend, the one who had been pursuing her for so long. He was soaking wet from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, and he had a crazed look in his eyes. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My husband hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped aside and let the man in. I could feel my blood turning to ice as he walked past me and into our living room. He sat down on our couch, still dripping wet, and looked around the room as if he had never been there before. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. My husband and I exchanged a worried glance. We didn't want to provoke him, but we didn't want to encourage him either. "We've been fine," my husband said. "But what are you doing here?" The man looked at my husband, his eyes narrowing. "I just wanted to check on you," he said. "Make sure you're doing okay." We both knew that was a lie. He was here because of our daughter. He had always been obsessed with her, and we had thought we had finally gotten rid of him when he moved to another city. But now he was back, and we didn't know what he was capable of. "Listen," my husband said, trying to sound firm but not threatening. "We appreciate your concern, but we think it's best if you leave. We don't want any trouble." The man stood up, and for a moment I thought he was going to leave. But then he turned to us and said, "You don't understand. I love her. I've always loved her, and I'll never stop loving her." With that, he walked out of our house and into the pouring rain. We watched as he got into his car and drove away, but we both knew that this was far from over. Over the next few weeks, we tried to stay vigilant. We made sure our daughter was always safe, and we kept an eye out for any signs of the man's presence. But we couldn't be everywhere at once, and one day our worst fears were realized. Our daughter came home from her boyfriend's house, and when she opened the door, she found an old doll lying on the ground, along with a handful of earth and needles. We didn't know what it meant, but we knew it was a message from her ex. He was still out there, still obsessed with her, and still willing to do anything to get her back. We called the police again, but they didn't seem to take us seriously. They had dealt with this man before, and they thought he was harmless. But we knew better. We knew that he was capable of anything, and that our daughter was in danger. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone again. His friends told us that he had moved to another city, and that he had cut off all communication with them. We didn't know if we should be relieved or even more afraid. We didn't know if he was really gone for good, or if he was just biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. We tried to put the whole ordeal behind us, to move on with our lives and forget about the man who had haunted us for so long. But we never really could. We always looked over our shoulders, always checked the locks on our doors and windows, always wondered if he was still out there watching us. And then one day we got a call from our daughter. She was crying hysterically, barely able to get the words out. "He's here," she said. "He's outside the house." We didn't hesitate. We called the police and rushed to our daughter's house as fast as we could. When we got there, we found her huddled in a corner, shaking with fear. She told us that she had heard a noise outside, and when she looked out the window, she saw him. Her ex-boyfriend was standing in her front yard, staring up at her window with a look of madness in his eyes. We stayed with our daughter that night, trying to calm her down and reassure her that she was safe. But we knew that we couldn't protect her forever. We knew that the man was still out there, still obsessed with her, and that he would stop at nothing to get her back. The next few days were a blur of fear and anxiety. We didn't leave our daughter's side, and we didn't let her out of our sight. We took turns keeping watch at night, and we made sure that all the doors and windows were securely locked. And then, just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, he was gone. We didn't know what had happened to him, but we knew that he had finally given up. Maybe he had found someone else to obsess over, or maybe he had realized that he could never have our daughter. We didn't know, and we didn't care. All we knew was that we could finally breathe a little easier. I can tell you a story, but I have to warn you that it might be disturbing and frightening. It started when I met a new friend who asked me to rent my parents' apartment to his employee. He promised to take full responsibility, and I trusted him. The new tenant transferred the money to my parents, and we didn't communicate with him in any way. However, after a couple of months, I started noticing a strange man appearing in my house. He was always dressed in odd combinations, and once I even saw him wearing his t-shirt backwards. I never saw which floor he went up to, as he always took the emergency stairs while I waited for the elevator. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then he started to appear more and more frequently. He would show up in different locations, even on the opposite side of the city, and he would always give me the chills. Then one night, I heard a loud banging on my door. I looked through the peephole, and there he was, the same man. I was terrified, so I immediately called the police. By the time they arrived, he had disappeared. I was shaken and couldn't understand why he was so interested in me. The next day, my friend who arranged for the apartment rental came to check on the place, and what he found was horrifying. The tenant had left in a hurry, and the apartment was in a state of disarray. But what was most alarming were the dozens of my pictures scattered everywhere. There were pictures of me standing in my window at home, walking down the street, and even photos of where I am as a child. I was completely shocked and didn't know what to do. My friend immediately cut off contact with the tenant and blacklisted him. The tenant left the city, but I was left feeling extremely uneasy and paranoid. I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was still following me. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. But one day when I was walking to work, I saw him again, but this time he was dressed normally. He looked right at me, and I froze. That's when I realized that he had been stalking me for months, watching my every move and planning who knows what. I was so terrified that I quit my job and moved to another city. I never heard from the tenant again, but I still have nightmares about that strange man and what he might have done to me if he had the chance. It was a terrifying experience that left me with scars that will never fade. Years have passed since that terrible time, but we still remember it as if it were yesterday. We still lock our doors and windows every night, and we still keep an eye out for any signs of danger. We know that the man who pursued our daughter is still out there somewhere, and we know that he could come back at any moment. But we also know that we are stronger now, and that we will do whatever it takes to protect our family. We will never forget the horror of that time, but we will also never let it control us. We are survivors, and we will always be ready for whatever comes our way. It was the summer of 2009 when the narrator first encountered I, a seemingly ordinary reader of their blog. I would leave comments on the posts, nothing out of the ordinary. But over time, the comments became more frequent and obsessive, and it wasn't long before they spilled over into social media. At first, it was just likes and comments, harmless enough, but then things took a dark turn. I began to message the narrator, saying that he knew where they were and what they were doing. The messages would tell them what they were wearing, who they were with, and even what they were eating. The stalker seemed to know everything about the narrator's life. The situation escalated when I told the narrator to leave their shopping bags near a bench, promising to deliver them to their door. This was too much for the narrator, and they sought the help of their older brother, who started accompanying them everywhere they went. But it didn't stop I. The stalker continued to send messages, knowing everything that was going on in the narrator's life. It was a year of terror, a year in which the narrator was never sure if they were being watched or followed. They moved to another city, changed their phone number, and only told their parents and closest friends where they were going. Even then, they could not shake the fear that I was still watching them. Years went by, and the narrator tried to move on with their life, but the fear never left them. They struggled to make friends and form relationships, always wondering if the person they were talking to was I in disguise. It was a constant weight on their shoulders, a fear that never left them. Then one day, the narrator received a message from a stranger on social media. Their heart sank, and they hesitated to open it. Was it I? Had he found them again? They took a deep breath and opened the message. It was just a spam message from a company, nothing to do with I. But the fear had already taken hold. Years later, the narrator still struggles with the fear. They try to tell themselves that they are safe now, that I can't find them, but they can never shake the feeling that they are being watched, that I is still out there, waiting to strike again. We met on the internet. He worked in law enforcement and was 6 years younger than me. We lived in different cities, and during all this time we saw each other 8 times. It was a non-binding date. We just spent time together. Once he came to me without warning. With his capabilities, it was not difficult to calculate my address. It bothered me because I wasn't planning anything serious. But he was serious, even offered me to move in with him. I answered neutrally, said that there was no need to hurry, and he took my words as consent. We continued to meet from time to time. Then I decided that this was not my man, and offered to break up. Naturally, he wasn't thrilled. I thought I was probably being too tough with him, and about a week later I texted him to see if he was okay. He responded with insults. Then I decided that I had done the right thing. Then he tried to persuade me to return to him, and after being refused, he began stalking me on social networks, calling me. There were 300 missed calls, threatening. On the advice of friends, I turned to the Department of Homeland Security. They talked to him there, and he texted me that God would punish me. After that, he came to my office and demanded to return to him the $1,500 he had spent on me. I had to promise, only for him to leave. I contacted the Department of Homeland Security again. After a while, I found out that he was fired from the authorities. He had a lot of comments, threats to me, apparently were the last straw. He wrote to me again, demanding a refund. I didn't return it, and a month later my car burned down. 2 weeks later, when I was taking my daughter to kindergarten, an unknown young man caught up with me and splashed some liquid in my face. I got burns. Fortunately, it wasn't hydrochloric acid. My face didn't corrode. 2 weeks later, they tried to set fire to my apartment. I understood that this man would not stop. For all 3 episodes, I contacted the police, but they were not included in the case in the future and were listed as unrelated. I got a call from the organized crime department and was told to come to the investigators. I was afraid it was a trap. Then he came to me. I didn't open the door and call the police. He was detained. We were confronted. He portrayed a martyr. He was released a day later. I lost my voice from the stress I experienced. I lived in fear. My father took my daughter to kindergarten. Friends brought groceries and spent the night at my place. I was locked up and was afraid to go outside, so I lived for more than 6 months. Then I got a call from the organized crime department and was told to come to the investigators. I was afraid it was a trap. Although my stalker was fired from the authorities, he could still have connections there. But I was told that an assassination attempt was organized on me. I was taken aback. Just in case, I took a friend with me and went to the investigators. It turned out that my pursuer hired a killer twice, but the first time the killer charged too high a price, and the second time the killer turned out to be a police officer. This saved me. My death was staged, a photo was taken. I gave the police my jewelry as proof, and 2 days later he was detained. He thought I was dead, and at the deposition he said what a whore I was and what an unhappy lover he was, and I deceived him. As a result, he was imprisoned for 8.5 years. I was still afraid that he would hire someone to get back at me, so I moved. I was 20, he was 25. We lived in neighboring cities. He wrote to me on the social network. I am a very sociable person and immediately made contact. Soon we started a relationship and we moved in together. At first everything was fine, but I just turned a blind eye to the first bells. He always talked about his exes in a negative way. As it turned out later, they all blocked him in social networks, and the girl who was with him before me could not get rid of him for a long time. In the end, she stabbed him in the heat of a quarrel. Only then did he fall behind. After a couple of months, he began to limit my communication with other people. Any attempts to communicate ended in scandals and insults to my friends and family. I thought I should leave him, and at that moment my mother died. Of course, he helped financially, but he behaved in the spirit of people are dying. Forget it. While I was preparing for the funeral, he drank beer and pretended that it didn't concern him. Other people helped me, and he exuded negativity in their direction, not understanding my feelings. That's when I made the final decision to leave. When I told him about the breakup of the relationship, he defiantly tried to commit suicide, so much so that I had to go back and call him an ambulance. He is a diabetic, injected himself with a lot of insulin. If you do this, hypoglycemia begins. Even hypoglycemic coma is possible. Began to turn pale and lose consciousness. An ambulance arrived. He was taken to the hospital. He asked me to stay with him every day. Against this background, I developed panic attacks, and I was already in the hospital. After I was discharged, I packed my things, and he threw a ring at me because I refused to marry him. After I moved, he wrote to me wherever he could and called me constantly. He threatened suicide, wrote wills, said that his sugar was jumping, and said goodbye. A couple of weeks later, his friends started writing to me, trying to reconcile us and make me look guilty. Then he realized that writing wouldn't solve anything and started threatening me and my loved ones with violence. I still keep screenshots and recordings of conversations, you never know what. He promised that he would not let me live in peace without him and demanded that I return. He didn't let up for 6 months, and I was very tired. I was very scared. It seemed that there was nowhere to run from this hell. I was gnawed by a sense of guilt because I did not immediately see the abuser in him. I felt guilty about everything. I promised to think about it, if only he would back off. It subsided, and we were even able to establish normal communication, as it seemed to me, but it didn't last long. He demanded to decide. I replied that I could not be with him, that simple human relations could be maintained. Threats and insults started again. He came to my house, tried to make peace, but after a couple of refusals, he switched only to online stalking. I blacklisted him, but he started a new page. I ignored him, contacted the police. They told me that at most they would talk to him, and it was unlikely that it would be of any use. When I talked about threats and stalking, I was told that I need to understand people better. Then he decided to demand back the gifts with the words, "I promised I wouldn't let you live." But realizing that this did not work either, at the end of autumn 2017, he wrote a statement to the police so that I would return the tablet given to me to him. He was refused to initiate proceedings, and he decided to file a lawsuit. I allowed him to have a conversation in the legal field. If the court decides what